When a mother and daughter vanish into the Maine fog during a fishing trip, the Coast Guard declares them lost at sea. But one man refuses to accept their fate. 8 months of desperate searching leads to a phone call that changes everything. A fisherman's glimpse of a yellow raincoat on a forbidden island. What secrets does the lonely lighthouse keeper hide? And why does every instinct scream that the official story is a lie? Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. Port Haven had always been a town that lived and breathed with the ocean's rhythm, its weathered wooden buildings standing sentinel against the relentless Maine coastline. The morning fog rolled in like clockwork, thick and ghostly, transforming familiar streets into mysterious corridors where shadows danced between street lamps that flickered even in daylight. This coastal hamlet, with its population of barely 3,000 souls, had witnessed countless storms, countless departures, and countless returns. But on that fateful September morning, when the fog hung heavier than anyone could remember, Port Haven would witness something that would haunt its residents for months to come. Eliza Graham stood at the weathered dock, her calloused hands gripping the rope that secured their modest fishing boat. The Sea Whisper. The vessel, though small and showing its age through patches of rust and faded blue paint, had been Robert's pride for over 2 decades before he passed it down to his daughter. Eliza's auburn hair caught the early morning light filtering through the mist, creating an almost ethereal glow around her determined face. She possessed that particular brand of quiet strength that coastal women develop, born from years of watching their loved ones disappear into the horizon with nothing but hope as their compass. 8-year-old Lucy bounded alongside the dock with the infectious energy that only children possess, her bright yellow rain boots splashing through puddles left by the retreating tide. Her small backpack, decorated with colorful sea creatures, bounced against her back as she chattered excitedly about the fish they would catch. Lucy's eyes, the same striking green as her mother's, sparkled with anticipation. She had been looking forward to this fishing trip for weeks, pestering her mother daily about when they could take the Sea Whisper out beyond the harbor. The harbor itself seemed unusually quiet that morning. The usual symphony of clanking rigging, creaking dock planks, and shouting fishermen had been muffled by the increasingly dense fog. Other boats remained moored, their captains casting wary glances at the approaching wall of mist that loomed beyond the harbor mouth like a living creature. The fog bank stretched across the horizon, a towering white wall that seemed to pulse with its own mysterious life force, swallowing the familiar lighthouse beacon that normally guided vessels safely home. Robert Graham stood at his kitchen window, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. At 72, his body bore the marks of 5 decades spent battling the Atlantic's moods. His silver beard, perpetually dampened by sea spray, framed a face carved by wind and worry. Deep lines around his blue eyes spoke of countless mornings spent scanning the horizon, searching for returning boats, counting them home like a shepherd counts sheep. Something in his gut twisted with unease as he watched his daughter and granddaughter prepare for departure. The fog was thicker than he had seen in years, and his arthritic joints ached with the particular pain that always preceded rough weather. The Sea Whisper's engine coughed to life with a familiar rumble that echoed off the harbor's wooden pilings. Eliza performed her ritual pre-departure checks with methodical precision, her movements fluid and practiced. She tested the radio, its static-filled crackle temporarily drowning out the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. The GPS device, though older than Lucy herself, flickered to life with reassuring green numbers. Life jackets were double-checked, emergency flares counted, and the small cooler packed with sandwiches and thermos bottles was secured beneath the bench seat. Lucy helped coil ropes with the serious concentration of a seasoned sailor, her small fingers working to mimic her mother's expert knots. The morning air carried the familiar cocktail of salt, seaweed, and diesel fuel that every fishing family knows by heart. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their harsh cries cutting through the muffled atmosphere as they followed the boat's wake, hopeful for scraps from a successful day's catch. As the Sea Whisper puttered past the harbor's protective jetty, the fog seemed to reach out with ghostly fingers, caressing the boat's hull and gradually obscuring the familiar landmarks that had guided generations of Port Haven fishermen. The lighthouse, usually a stalwart beacon visible for miles, became nothing more than a faint glow in the increasing gloom. The comfortable chatter between mother and daughter gradually quieted as the fog thickened around them, creating an almost cathedral-like hush that made even whispers seem too loud. Hours passed without radio contact. The Coast Guard monitoring station noted the absence of check-ins from several vessels that had departed that morning. But the Sea Whisper's silence stretched longer than the others. Robert paced his kitchen floor, his coffee growing cold as he monitored the marine radio, listening for familiar voices cutting through the static. His unease blossomed into genuine worry as the fog bank refused to lift, creating an impenetrable barrier between the harbor and the open ocean. When the distress call finally came through, it arrived not from the Sea Whisper, but from another fishing vessel reporting debris in the water. The Coast Guard response was swift and thorough, their orange and white cutters cutting through the fog with searchlights piercing the gloom like desperate prayers. The search expanded throughout the day, helicopters adding their mechanical thunder to the symphony of rescue efforts. The discovery came at sunset, when the fog finally began its reluctant retreat. The Sea Whisper floated empty and battered, her port side scraped raw by contact with hidden rocks, her small cabin windows spiderwebbed with cracks from an impact that spoke of violence and panic. Personal items floated nearby like scattered memories, Lucy's bright yellow rain boots bobbing in the gentle swells alongside Eliza's waterlogged thermos. The boat's radio dangled uselessly by its cord, its plastic casing cracked and filled with seawater. Coast Guard investigators concluded their assessment with clinical efficiency. The evidence pointed to a tragic but familiar story, one that had played out countless times along this unforgiving coastline. Disorientation in the fog, impact with submerged rocks, panic, and the cold Atlantic claiming 2 more victims. The official report would classify it as an accidental drowning, case closed, files sealed away in bureaucratic cabinets. Robert Graham received the news in his living room, surrounded by family photographs that now seemed to mock him with their frozen happiness. The official's words washed over him like a tide he refused to acknowledge, their clinical explanations falling on ears that heard only the absence of his daughter's laughter and his granddaughter's excited chatter. His hands, which had pulled countless nets from these same waters, trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with the force of his disbelief. 8 months had transformed Robert Graham into a specter of his former self. His once robust frame had withered to sinew and bone, his shoulders permanently hunched from countless hours bent over nautical charts. The silver beard that had once been his pride now grew wild and unkempt, streaked with premature white that spoke of grief aged beyond its years. His hands, once steady enough to thread the finest fishing line in a gale, now trembled with exhaustion, and the particular madness that comes from hope stretched too thin. The kitchen table had become his command center, buried beneath layers of laminated charts, tide tables, and weather reports that he studied with the intensity of a military strategist. Red circles marked every rock formation, every hidden reef, every impossible crevice where 2 souls might somehow survive. Coffee rings stained the maps like tears, permanent reminders of sleepless nights spent calculating drift patterns and current velocities. The marine radio crackled incessantly, its static-filled voice his only companion during the long hours before dawn, when even the seagulls abandoned their vigil. Port Haven's residents had learned to avert their eyes when they encountered Robert shuffling through the harbor in his threadbare peacoat, muttering calculations under his breath. The same neighbors who had once sought his advice on weather patterns now whispered behind cupped hands about the old man who had lost his grip on reality. Children were ushered past his house quickly, their parents unwilling to explain why the kind grandfather who used to hand out penny candy now scared them with his hollow stare and urgent, incomprehensible mutterings about tidal zones and search grids. His daily ritual had become a pilgrimage of obsession. Every morning at 4:30, before the harbor stirred to life, Robert would launch his small dinghy into waters that had claimed his family. The boat, barely seaworthy and patched with mismatched fiberglass, carried him to coordinates he had memorized like prayers. His weathered hands gripped the outboard motor's tiller with white-knuckled determination as he navigated through fog banks that would have sent younger, saner men racing back to shore. The townspeople watched from their windows as he disappeared into the mist, day after day, returning hours later with the defeated posture of a man who had once again failed to find what everyone else knew was lost forever. His logbooks, meticulously maintained despite his deteriorating condition, documented water temperatures, wind patterns, and debris fields with scientific precision. Each entry ended with the same devastating notation: no sign of survivors. Dr. Sarah Chen had made house calls that became exercises in futility, finding Robert increasingly gaunt and disconnected from reality. His blood pressure readings alarmed her, numbers that spoke of a cardiovascular system pushed beyond endurance by stress and sleepless nights. The prescription bottles she left behind remained unopened on his kitchen counter, surrounded by empty cans of soup and forgotten cups of coffee that had grown cold and moldy. The transformation was most evident in his eyes, once the sharp blue of deep ocean water, now clouded with exhaustion and something approaching madness. They held a desperate intensity that made casual conversation impossible, scanning every face for some sign of understanding, some acknowledgement that his quest was not the delusion everyone believed it to be. His conversations, when they occurred at all, consisted of technical jargon about ocean currents and survival rates that sent his listeners backing away with uncomfortable smiles and promises to pray for his peace of mind. On the morning that would change everything, Robert sat hunched over his charts as usual, a cup of black coffee growing cold beside his elbow. His arthritic fingers traced the familiar coastline for the 1,000th time, following current patterns that had become as familiar as the lines on his palms. The marine radio provided its constant soundtrack of fishing reports and weather updates, background noise to his mathematical obsessions. The telephone's shrill ring cut through the morning stillness like a blade. Robert's head snapped up, his movement so sudden that charts slid to the floor in a cascade of rustling paper. The sound was so unexpected, so foreign after months of self-imposed isolation, that he stared at the device for several rings before his trembling hand reached for the receiver. Samuel Olson's voice crackled through the connection, rough with the particular hoarseness that comes from a lifetime of shouting over engine noise and ocean wind. The commercial fisherman's words came in short, urgent bursts, as if he feared his courage might fail before he could deliver his message. He had been reluctant to call, he explained, because what he had seen seemed impossible, the kind of vision that suggests too many hours alone at sea. But the details Samuel provided struck Robert like physical blows. The small figure he had glimpsed on Crow's Nest Island, barely visible through his binoculars, moved with the particular gait of a child. The flash of yellow clothing, the same bright shade as Lucy's beloved rain boots, had made him circle back for a second look. The girl had vanished before he could confirm his suspicions, disappearing behind the rocky outcroppings that made the island treacherous to approach. Robert's entire body began to shake as Samuel described the isolated landmass that sat like a forgotten afterthought in the Atlantic, its lighthouse dark and abandoned for over a decade. The island was barely large enough to support the weathered structure that had once guided ships safely through the treacherous waters surrounding it. Few fishermen ventured close anymore, deterred by the jagged rocks that surrounded its shore like broken teeth. The hope that flooded through Robert's system was almost narcotic in its intensity, washing away 8 months of accumulated despair with the force of a spring tide. His hands, which had trembled with exhaustion moments before, steadied as he gripped the phone receiver. His voice, unused to hope, cracked as he pressed Samuel for every detail, every nuance of what the fisherman had witnessed. The transformation was immediate and startling. Color returned to Robert's gaunt cheeks as blood pressure spiked with renewed purpose. His eyes, clouded with months of defeat, suddenly blazed with the fierce intensity that had once made him Port Haven's most successful fisherman. The charts on his floor were forgotten as his mind raced ahead to coordinates and approach routes, calculating distances and fuel requirements with the precision of a man whose rusty skills were suddenly sharp again. For the first time in 8 months, Robert Graham smiled, and the expression sat strangely on his weathered face, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The madness that had consumed him was still there, but it had found focus, crystallizing into something that might yet prove to be sanity's distant cousin. His granddaughter was alive, and somewhere on that god-forsaken island, answers waited. The Coast Guard cutter sliced through the Atlantic swells with mechanical precision, its diesel engines thrumming a steady rhythm that seemed to match Robert's racing heartbeat. Chief of Police Abbott stood at the bow, his stocky frame braced against the boat's rolling motion, his weathered face set in the particular expression of a man who had seen too many false hopes shatter against reality's harsh shore. At 58, Abbott had learned to temper optimism with pragmatism, and something in his gut told him this expedition would end like all the others, with disappointed families and empty boats returning to harbor. The morning fog clung to the water's surface like ethereal fingers, creating pockets of visibility that opened and closed without warning. Samuel Olsen gripped the boat's rail with white knuckles, his eyes fixed on the approaching silhouette of Crow's Nest Island. The commercial fisherman's confidence had wavered during the night, doubt creeping in like cold seawater through a cracked hull. Had he really seen what he thought he had seen? Or had isolation and too many hours staring at empty horizons finally played tricks on his weather-beaten mind? Robert stood apart from the others, his gaunt frame rigid with anticipation. Every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring, ready to launch him toward whatever answers the island might hold. His hands, which had trembled with exhaustion for months, were now steady with purpose, gripping his binoculars so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The salt spray that misted across the deck felt like baptismal water, washing away the accumulated grime of his obsession and replacing it with crystalline clarity. Crow's Nest Island emerged from the fog like a forgotten cathedral, its jagged cliffs rising nearly 40 feet from the churning Atlantic. The lighthouse stood sentinel at its highest point, a weathered white tower that had once served as salvation for countless vessels, but now appeared more like a tombstone, marking the grave of maritime hope. Decades of neglect had stripped most of the paint from its cylindrical walls, leaving behind streaks of rust that ran down its surface like dried blood. The island itself was barely an acre of granite and stunted vegetation, shaped by centuries of relentless wind and waves into something that seemed more like a natural fortress than a place where humans might choose to live. Scraggly pine trees, twisted into grotesque shapes by constant exposure to Atlantic storms, clung to crevices in the rock with desperate determination. The only visible structure besides the lighthouse was a small wooden shack, its weathered shingles dark with moisture and age. As their boat approached the island's only viable landing spot, a narrow strip of rocky beach protected by a small jetty built from stacked stones, a figure emerged from the lighthouse. Alistair Croft moved with the unhurried gait of a man accustomed to solitude, his tall frame clothed in faded work clothes that hung loose on his spare build. His hair, prematurely white and pulled back in a neat ponytail, caught the morning light as he descended the winding path from the lighthouse to the shore. Abbott studied the hermit through his own binoculars, noting the man's seemingly relaxed demeanor and the absence of any obvious signs of distress or guilt. Alistair's face, weathered by exposure but oddly ageless, wore an expression of mild curiosity rather than the panic one might expect from someone harboring dark secrets. His hands, visible as he raised one in greeting, appeared clean and steady, showing none of the nervous tremors that usually accompanied deception. The landing was treacherous, requiring careful navigation between submerged rocks that could easily hole their hull. Abbott directed the Coast Guard pilot with terse commands, his law enforcement instincts heightened by the isolation and the particular vulnerability that comes from being dependent on a single boat for escape. The waves that crashed against the jetty sent spray high into the air, creating rainbow patterns in the morning sunlight that seemed almost mockingly beautiful given the gravity of their mission. Alistair waited for them at the water's edge, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested patience rather than anxiety. As they disembarked, Robert noticed that the man's blue eyes held an unusual depth, as if they contained secrets that went far beyond the simple question of missing persons. The hermit's face was clean-shaven and surprisingly well-maintained for someone living in isolation, suggesting a level of self-care that contradicted the typical image of a mad recluse. The lighthouse interior revealed itself to be surprisingly well-maintained, its circular rooms clean and organized with the precision of someone accustomed to making do with limited space. Handmade furniture crafted from driftwood and salvaged materials filled the living areas, each piece showing evidence of considerable skill and patience. Books lined makeshift shelves, their titles ranging from maritime history to philosophy, suggesting an intellect that remained active despite years of isolation. Abbott's trained eye cataloged every detail as they conducted their search, looking for any sign that the lighthouse had housed additional occupants. The beds were neat and showed evidence of only single occupancy. Personal belongings were sparse but well-maintained, suggesting someone who took care of what little he possessed. The small kitchen contained provisions for one person, carefully rationed and organized with military precision. Alistair answered their questions with the calm patience of someone accustomed to explaining his simple existence to occasional visitors. His voice carried the particular cadence of someone who spent most of his time alone, words chosen carefully and delivered with deliberate precision. He spoke of finding peace in solitude, of the satisfaction that came from maintaining the lighthouse as his personal monument to maritime history, of the simple pleasure he derived from watching the ocean's ever-changing moods. Robert's intuition screamed against the surface tranquility of the scene. Something in Alistair's too perfect composure, in the way his eyes never quite met their direct gaze, in the subtle tension that seemed to radiate from his seemingly relaxed frame, triggered every instinct the old fisherman had developed over decades of reading weather patterns and ocean moods. The lighthouse felt like a stage set, too clean, too organized, too deliberately normal for someone who had supposedly chosen complete isolation. The search yielded nothing concrete, no hidden rooms, no signs of struggle, no evidence that anyone other than Alistair had inhabited the structure in recent months. Abbott's frustration grew with each empty drawer, each unremarkable closet, each perfectly ordinary explanation for what should have been extraordinary circumstances. The chief's faith in his own investigative abilities began to waver as the morning stretched on without producing a single suspicious detail. Samuel's confidence crumbled like a sandcastle struck by high tide. The certainty that had driven him to make that fateful phone call evaporated in the face of Alistair's reasonable explanations and the lighthouse's stubborn normalcy. Self-doubt crept in like fog, making him question not just what he had seen, but his own reliability as a witness to anything beyond the mundane routine of commercial fishing. As they prepared to leave, Abbott's official decision fell like a gavel, final and unappealable. The investigation would be suspended once again, filed away with the dozens of other false leads and desperate hopes that had accumulated over the past 8 months. The resources of law enforcement could not be indefinitely devoted to chasing shadows and the fevered dreams of grief-stricken family members. Robert's rage built like a storm system gathering strength over warm water, but he channeled it inward, recognizing that any outward display would only confirm their assessment of his deteriorating mental state. His hands clenched and unclenched rhythmically as he fought to maintain control, his eyes never leaving Alistair's face, searching for some crack in the hermit's carefully maintained facade. The old fisherman's instincts, honed by a lifetime of reading the ocean's subtle warning signs, detected something wrong beneath the surface calm, something that made his skin crawl despite the absence of concrete evidence. 3 days passed like a fever dream, each hour stretching into eternity, as Robert wrestled with the crushing weight of official failure. The police boat had returned to harbor with nothing but empty hands and disappointed faces, leaving him to pace the worn floorboards of his kitchen like a caged animal. Sleep remained elusive, his mind replaying every moment of the lighthouse visit, analyzing Alistair's words, his gestures, the almost imperceptible hesitations that had triggered Robert's maritime-trained intuition for hidden dangers. The decision to seek out Samuel came at 3 a.m, born from desperation and the particular madness that overtakes grieving souls when all conventional paths have been exhausted. Robert pulled on his ancient peacoat, its wool fabric heavy with the accumulated salt and sorrow of countless journeys, and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness that blanketed Port Haven like a shroud. His breath formed ghostly clouds in the frigid air as he made his way through the sleeping town's narrow streets, guided only by the faint glow of harbor lights reflecting off the low-hanging fog. Samuel Olson's house sat on the weathered edge of the fishing district, a modest Cape Cod structure that had sheltered 3 generations of commercial fishermen. Paint peeled from its cedar shingles in long strips, testament to the relentless assault of salt air and neglect that came with lives spent more on water than on land. The windows were dark, their glass streaked with the residue of countless storms, but Robert could see the faint outline of Samuel's fishing boat moored at the private dock that extended into the harbor like an arthritic finger. The fisherman answered his door with the wary alertness of someone accustomed to emergency calls in the darkness. Samuel's face, illuminated by the porch light's yellow glow, showed the particular exhaustion that follows failed endeavors, the hollow-eyed look of a man questioning his own sanity. 3 days of self-doubt had taken their toll, etching new lines around his eyes and adding a tremor to his weathered hands that spoke of nerves stretched beyond their breaking point. Robert's appearance at his doorstep seemed to physically diminish Samuel, his shoulders sagging as if the old man's presence confirmed his worst fears about the consequences of speaking up. The commercial fisherman's living room reflected the sparse functionality of someone who spent most of his life at sea, furnished with cast-off pieces and maritime memorabilia that served as the only decoration in an otherwise utilitarian space. Fishing nets draped over wooden chairs, their mesh patterns creating intricate shadows in the lamplight. The weight of confession hung between them like fog rolling in from the Atlantic. Samuel's reluctance was palpable, manifesting in the way he avoided direct eye contact, his fingers unconsciously picking at loose threads on his flannel shirt. The fisherman's conscience had been tormenting him for 72 hours, guilt eating at him like battery acid, as he wrestled with the knowledge that his incomplete honesty might have doomed a child to continued captivity. When Samuel finally rose from his threadbare armchair, his movements carried the heavy deliberation of someone approaching a moment that would change everything. He disappeared into the house's depths, leaving Robert alone with the ticking of an ancient ship's chronometer and the distant sound of waves lapping against the dock pilings. The old fisherman's heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo the chronometer's steady beat, marking time toward a revelation that would either vindicate his obsession or confirm his descent into madness. Samuel returned carrying a small wooden box, its surface scarred by years of maritime exposure and handling. The container had once held fishing tackle, but now served as a repository for the ocean's random gifts, the odd debris that fishermen occasionally pulled from their nets or spotted floating in the endless expanse of the Atlantic. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of sea glass, unusual shells, and weathered fragments of wood that had been shaped by salt water and time into abstract sculptures. Nestled among these oceanic artifacts was a small wooden toy, its carved surface smoothed by the ocean's touch, but still recognizable as a miniature boat. The craftsmanship was exquisite despite its diminutive size, every detail rendered with the loving precision of someone who understood the romance and danger of maritime life. Delicate rigging lines were carved into the wood with hairline precision, and tiny cleats adorned the deck with realistic detail that spoke of hours spent in careful creation. Robert's breath caught in his throat as his trembling fingers lifted the toy from its resting place. The wood was warm to the touch, as if it still held some essence of the child who had once cherished it. On the toy's stern, barely visible unless held at the proper angle to catch the light, were two initials carved with the uncertain precision of young hands. L.G. Lucy Graham had carved her mark into this treasure, claiming it as her own with the territorial instinct that children apply to their most precious possessions. The emotional impact hit Robert like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending waves of validation coursing through his exhausted system. This was proof, tangible and undeniable, that Lucy had been near Crow's Nest Island. The toy's condition suggested recent exposure to seawater, not the years of oceanic tumbling that would have been necessary for it to drift from the original accident site to Samuel's nets. The wood retained too much of its original character, the initials too crisp and clear to have survived months of Atlantic currents. Samuel's confession poured out in a torrent of guilt and justification, his words tumbling over each other as he explained his reasoning for withholding this crucial evidence. The fisherman had convinced himself that the toy was circumstantial, meaningless without other supporting proof. He had feared that presenting it would only fan the flames of Robert's obsession, leading to more futile searches and deeper psychological damage for a man already teetering on the edge of complete breakdown. But seeing Robert's reaction to the discovery, witnessing the transformation from defeat to fierce determination, Samuel realized the magnitude of his mistake. The toy was more than evidence. It was hope made manifest, proof that the old man's instincts had been correct all along. Lucy Graham was alive, or had been alive recently enough to leave this wooden calling card floating in the waters near Alistair's island fortress. The plan formed between them with the spontaneous chemistry of two men who had spent their lives reading weather patterns and making split-second decisions about when to run for shelter and when to ride out the storm. They would return to Crow's Nest Island without official sanction, armed only with their combined maritime experience and the desperate courage that comes from knowing that time was running out. Samuel's boat would provide the transportation, his knowledge of the island's treacherous approaches the key to landing undetected. Robert's transformation was immediate and startling, the wooden toy acting like a talisman that restored his confidence and sharpened his focus. The trembling in his hands ceased, replaced by the steady grip of someone who had found solid ground after months of floundering in quicksand. His eyes, clouded with doubt and self-recrimination for so long, now blazed with the cold fire of absolute certainty. Alistair Croft had lied, and somewhere in that lighthouse fortress, his granddaughter waited for rescue. The weight of the toy in his pocket served as a constant reminder that miracles were still possible, that sometimes the ocean gave back what it had seemingly claimed forever. As dawn approached, painting the harbor in shades of rose and gold. Robert Graham felt truly alive for the first time since that terrible September morning, when the fog had swallowed his world whole. The moon hung like a broken fingernail in the star-scattered sky, providing just enough illumination to guide Samuel's weathered fishing boat through the treacherous waters surrounding Crow's Nest Island. The vessel's engine had been muffled with old blankets and canvas, reducing its mechanical rumble to barely more than a whisper against the backdrop of waves lapping against the hull. Robert crouched in the bow, his arthritic joints protesting the uncomfortable position. But his eyes remained fixed on the lighthouse silhouette that grew larger with each passing minute. Samuel navigated with the instinctive precision of someone who had spent 40 years reading water patterns in darkness, avoiding the submerged rocks that had claimed countless vessels over the decades. His weathered hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold Atlantic air. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was madness, that two aging fishermen had no business playing detective in waters that could kill them as easily as swatting flies. The approach required threading the boat through a maze of granite teeth that jutted from the water like the remnants of some prehistoric creature's jaw. Waves crashed against these obstacles with explosive force, sending spray 20 feet into the air and creating a cacophony that would mask any sound their approach might generate. The salt spray stung their faces like frozen needles, and the constant motion of the small vessel made every movement a careful calculation against the possibility of being thrown overboard. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo the waves striking the island's rocky shore. The wooden toy in his pocket pressed against his leg with each movement, a tangible reminder of why they were risking their lives in these treacherous waters. His granddaughter was somewhere on that god-forsaken island, and no amount of physical danger would deter him from the rescue mission that had consumed his every waking moment. They anchored the boat in a small cove on the island's lee side, where a cluster of barnacle-encrusted rocks provided some protection from the Atlantic's relentless assault. The landing required a dangerous leap from the boat's gunwale to a slippery ledge barely wide enough for their feet, with churning water waiting below to claim anyone who miscalculated the distance. Samuel moved first, his fisherman's agility serving him well as he found purchase on the wet granite and secured a rope to guide Robert's more cautious descent. The lighthouse loomed above them like a pale sentinel, its white-painted surface ghostly in the moonlight. No lights showed in any of the structure's windows, suggesting that Alistair had retired for the evening. But both men moved with the careful stealth of burglars, approaching a potentially occupied building. Every footstep on the loose gravel path seemed to echo like gunshots in the island's oppressive silence, broken only by the constant background symphony of waves and wind. Robert's flashlight beam, filtered through red cellophane to preserve their night vision, revealed details that had escaped their notice during the official daytime investigation. Scratches in the lighthouse's foundation stones suggested recent construction work, areas where mortar had been disturbed and hastily replaced. Small metal fixtures, barely visible in the darkness, hinted at electrical connections that seemed inconsistent with the building's supposed abandonment of modern conveniences. The lighthouse door yielded to Samuel's lock-picking skills, knowledge gained from years of dealing with stubborn fishing equipment and improvised repairs in remote locations. The hinges protested with barely audible squeaks as they eased the door open, pausing after each sound to listen for any indication that their presence had been detected. The interior was exactly as they remembered from the official visit, sterile and organized with the unsettling precision of someone maintaining a facade. Robert's trained eye, now sharpened by desperate purpose, noticed inconsistencies that had escaped official scrutiny. Where patterns on the wooden floor suggested foot traffic to areas that should have been unused. Dust accumulation was uneven, heavier in some corners and completely absent in others, indicating recent cleaning that contradicted Alistair's claims of simple, unchanging routine. The very air seemed to hold secrets, carrying faint odors that suggested the presence of more than one person despite the hermit's protestations of solitude. The discovery came when Robert's flashlight beam caught a barely perceptible difference in the floorboard pattern near the lighthouse's central spiral staircase. One section of planking showed different wood grain, newer nails, and a subtle elevation difference that became obvious once noticed. Samuel's fisherman's knife slipped easily between the planks, revealing hinges that had been carefully concealed beneath a thin layer of sawdust and wood stain. The trapdoor lifted with surprising ease, its counterweights suggesting frequent use despite its perfect camouflage. A narrow wooden ladder descended into absolute darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of their flashlight beams into what appeared to be a hand-excavated chamber beneath the lighthouse's foundation. The air that rose from the opening carried the musty scent of earth and stone, mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling that made both men's stomachs clench with instinctive revulsion. Robert descended first, his arthritic joints protesting each rung as he lowered himself into the underground chamber. The space revealed itself gradually as his flashlight beam swept across rough stone walls that had been carved from the island's living granite with painstaking effort. The ceiling was barely high enough for a man to stand upright, creating a sense of claustrophobic oppression that pressed down like a physical weight. Samuel followed with reluctant determination, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the confined space triggered the latent claustrophobia that many fishermen develop after spending too much time in small boat cabins during rough weather. His hands shook as he added his flashlight beam to Robert's, doubling the illumination and revealing the full scope of Alistair's underground sanctuary. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them arranged in precise rows with the obsessive organization of someone whose madness had found perfect structure. Each image showed mothers and daughters, some clearly torn from newspaper clippings, others appearing to be personal photographs that could only have been obtained through intimate access to the subjects' lives. The pictures were mounted with museum-quality care, protected by glass or plastic covers, and surrounded by elaborate frames made from driftwood and shells. Dried flowers formed garlands between the photographs, their brittle petals creating a macabre decoration that spoke of death masquerading as celebration. The flowers had once been fresh, carefully arranged with the skill of someone who understood floral composition, but time had mummified them into ghostly shadows of their former beauty. The sweet scent of their decay mingled with the chamber's musty air, creating an atmosphere that seemed to cling to their clothing and skin. At the chamber's far end stood an altar constructed from salvaged materials, pieces of ship's wheels, anchor chains, and weathered planking arranged into a shrine that seemed to worship the ocean's power to unite and separate families. Candles in various states of consumption covered every surface, their wax having dripped and pooled into bizarre sculptural formations that resembled frozen tears. The altar's centerpiece was a collection of personal items, jewelry, toys, and photographs arranged with the reverent care usually reserved for religious relics. Robert's flashlight beam lingered on items that made his blood freeze in his veins. A child's bracelet, its silver charm shaped like a dolphin, lay next to a woman's wedding ring that gleamed despite the chamber's humidity. Small toys, similar to the one in his pocket, were arranged in neat rows like soldiers standing eternal guard over their absent owners. Each item told a story of loss, of lives interrupted and families destroyed by whatever twisted philosophy had driven Alistair to create this underground monument to his obsession. The photographs seemed to watch them with accusing eyes, faces frozen in moments of happiness that had been stolen and perverted into decorations for a madman's sanctuary. Some of the images were obviously old, yellowed, and faded, suggesting that Alistair's compulsion stretched back decades, while others appeared recent, their colors still vibrant, and their subjects clearly identifiable as people who had vanished from coastal communities up and down the Atlantic seaboard. Samuel's breathing became increasingly labored as the full scope of the horror revealed itself, his fisherman's pragmatism struggling to process the evidence of systematic predation that surrounded them. This was not the random violence of a moment's madness, but the carefully orchestrated collection of a mind that had turned the ocean's natural cruelty into a tool for satisfying its own twisted needs. A sound from deeper within the underground chamber froze both men where they stood, their flashlight beams wavering as trembling hands struggled to maintain steady illumination. The noise was barely perceptible, a soft rustling that could have been mistaken for settling earth or shifting stones. But Robert's grandfather instincts recognized it immediately as the sound of human movement. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he feared it might betray their presence to whoever or whatever lurked in the chamber's darker recesses. The beam of Robert's flashlight swept across the chamber's far wall, revealing a narrow passageway that extended beyond their underground sanctuary into what appeared to be a network of interconnected chambers carved from the island's granite foundation. The excavation work represented years of backbreaking labor, tons of stone removed bucket by bucket, and somehow disposed of without detection. The scope of Alistair's project spoke to an obsession that had consumed decades of his life, transforming the lighthouse into something far more sinister than a simple hermit's retreat. Following the sound deeper into the labyrinth, Robert's flashlight beam suddenly illuminated something that made his knees nearly buckle with the force of recognition and relief. Eliza sat chained to the wall in a small alcove, her once vibrant auburn hair now matted and dull, her face gaunt from months of inadequate nutrition. But her eyes, those same green eyes that had sparkled with determination on countless fishing expeditions, still blazed with the fierce protective instinct that had sustained her through 8 months of captivity. Beside her, curled against her mother's side like a wounded animal seeking shelter, Lucy appeared smaller and more fragile than Robert remembered. The 8-year-old's bright yellow rain boots, now scuffed and faded, were the only splash of color in the gray stone chamber. Her small frame was wrapped in a blanket that had once been white, but now bore the stains of prolonged confinement. Despite everything, she had retained the peaceful expression of childhood sleep, her breathing steady and rhythmic against her mother's protective embrace. The chains that bound them were not the crude restraints of a hasty kidnapping, but carefully crafted manacles that showed evidence of padding and adjustment, designed for long-term use without causing permanent physical damage. This attention to their captive's physical well-being spoke to Alistair's twisted philosophy, his belief that he was protecting rather than imprisoning these families. The chains were connected to eye bolts driven deep into the granite walls, installations that had required considerable planning and engineering expertise. Robert's hands shook as he fumbled with the lock mechanisms, his arthritic fingers struggling with the intricate metalwork that secured his family's bonds. Each second stretched into eternity as he worked, knowing that discovery by Alistair would mean not rescue, but joining his daughter and granddaughter in permanent captivity. The metallic clicking of his attempts seemed to echo through the chamber like gunshots, each sound a potential death knell for their desperate rescue mission. Eliza's eyes fluttered open as her father's weathered face came into focus in the flashlight's glow. The recognition that dawned in her expression was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, hope replacing the resigned despair that had sustained her through months of psychological torment. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words that her weakened voice couldn't quite manage, but her meaning was clear in the desperate gratitude that flooded her features. The approaching footsteps from the chamber's entrance eliminated any possibility of stealth, their heavy rhythm echoing through the granite passages with the inevitability of approaching doom. Alistair's voice preceded his physical appearance, calm and conversational, as if he were greeting expected dinner guests rather than confronting intruders in his underground prison. His tone carried the particular cadence of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation countless times in his imagination, prepared for the day when his carefully constructed world would be discovered. The hermit appeared in the passageway entrance like a specter materializing from stone, his tall frame backlit by a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the chamber walls. In the flickering light, his face appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, the features of someone whose sanity had been eroded by years of isolation and obsession. His hands, Robert noticed with growing alarm, held not weapons, but keys, the implements of control that had maintained his captive's imprisonment. Alistair's explanation flowed with the practiced ease of someone who had justified his actions so many times that the reasoning had become automatic, a catechism of twisted logic that transformed kidnapping into salvation. He spoke of the ocean's cruelty, of families torn apart by forces beyond their control, of his mission to provide protection from a world that seemed determined to separate mothers from daughters. His voice carried the conviction of someone who genuinely believed he was performing acts of mercy rather than committing crimes of unthinkable violation. The hermit's own tragedy emerged in fragmented revelations, the loss of his wife and daughter in a boating accident that had shattered his sanity and rebuilt it according to principles that made sense only within the confines of his damaged mind. He had spent years watching rescue attempts fail, witnessing the ocean claim family after family, until he had convinced himself that intervention was not just justified, but morally imperative. In his twisted worldview, the underground chambers represented safety, permanence, protection from the chaos that raged above ground. Eliza's movement was subtle but deliberate, her weakened body summoning reserves of strength that motherhood had somehow preserved through months of captivity. She shifted her position slightly, placing herself more directly between Alistair and Lucy, a human shield powered by instincts that transcended physical limitations. Her eyes met her father's across the chamber, communicating a message that needed no words, a final request that carried the weight of 8 months of desperate hope. The confrontation erupted with shocking suddenness. Eliza's desperate lunge toward Alistair creating the chaos that Robert needed to reach his granddaughter. The chains that had held her captive became weapons as she swung them with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose, their metallic links striking stone and flesh with equal force. Her sacrifice was immediate and absolute, trading her own safety for the precious seconds that would allow her father to free Lucy from her bonds. Robert's hands worked with surprising steadiness as adrenaline overrode arthritis, the lock mechanisms yielding to his desperate manipulation with almost miraculous ease. Lucy's small body felt impossibly light as he lifted her into his arms, her unconscious form molding against his chest with the trust that only children can maintain even in the face of unthinkable trauma. Her breathing remained steady, despite the chaos erupting around them, her 8-year-old resilience somehow protecting her from the full awareness of their desperate circumstances. The race through the underground passages became a nightmare of flickering shadows and echoing footsteps, Robert's flashlight beam creating a tunnel of vision through absolute darkness, while Lucy's weight seemed to both anchor and motivate his flight. Behind them, the sounds of struggle continued, Eliza's determination buying them precious time with a currency that Robert knew he could never repay. His lungs burned with each breath, his legs trembling with exertion that his aged body was never meant to endure. The lighthouse ladder presented an almost insurmountable challenge, requiring him to balance Lucy's unconscious weight while climbing one-handed toward the trapdoor that represented salvation. Each rung was a victory of will over physical limitation, his grandson carrying arms cramping with the strain, while his free hand gripped the wooden rails with white-knuckled determination. Above them, the sound of Samuel's marine radio crackled with urgent transmissions, the Coast Guard responding to the fisherman's emergency call with the efficiency of a well-practiced rescue operation. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before Robert, its sterile white walls echoing with the soft whisper of rubber-soled shoes and the distant beeping of monitoring equipment. He sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair that had become his universe for the past 18 hours, his weathered hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Lucy lay beyond the observation window, her small form nearly lost among the tangle of medical equipment that monitored her recovery from 8 months of captivity and malnutrition. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from Lucy's room, with the careful expression of someone delivering news that balanced hope with caution. The child's physical condition was surprisingly stable, considering her ordeal, but the psychological trauma would require months, perhaps years, of patient healing. Lucy's body had adapted to limited nutrition and confinement, but her spirit remained intact, protected by the same resilience that had sustained generations of Port Haven children through countless maritime hardships. The town's response began before Robert and Lucy had even left the hospital. A grassroots mobilization that spoke to the deep bonds that held small coastal communities together in times of crisis. Margaret Sullivan, the harbor master's wife, organized a meal rotation that ensured fresh food appeared on Robert's doorstep 3 times daily, each dish prepared with the particular love that older women reserve for feeding those who cannot feed themselves. The meals arrived in containers that didn't need to be returned, understanding that grief makes even simple social obligations feel insurmountable. Thomas Mitchell, the hardware store owner, appeared at Robert's house with a truck full of supplies and a crew of volunteers who transformed Lucy's bedroom from a shrine to memory into a child's sanctuary. Fresh paint covered walls that had remained untouched since her disappearance, while new furniture replaced pieces that carried too many associations with loss. The workers moved with quiet efficiency, understanding that healing sometimes required physical transformation of spaces that had become monuments to grief. Lucy's return to consciousness came gradually, like dawn breaking through persistent fog. Her green eyes, so much like her mother's, fluttered open to find her grandfather's weathered face watching over her with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had nearly lost everything that mattered. The recognition that dawned in her expression was complicated. Joy mingled with confusion as her young mind struggled to process 8 months of captivity and the absence of the mother who had been her constant companion. The child psychologist, Dr. Amanda Reeves, became a regular presence in their lives, her gentle questioning helping Lucy navigate the complex emotions of survival guilt and traumatic memory. Their sessions took place in Robert's living room, transformed into a play therapy space where toys and art supplies provided Lucy with non-verbal means of expressing experiences that were too complex for 8-year-old vocabulary. The grandfather learned to read his granddaughter's moods through subtle changes in her artwork, watching for signs of nightmares or breakthrough memories. Robert's own transformation was equally profound, but more subtle, his months of obsessive searching replaced by the focused attention that Lucy's recovery demanded. The maritime charts that had covered every surface of his kitchen were carefully folded away, replaced by children's books, art supplies, and the mundane detritus of daily life with a traumatized child. His hands, which had trembled with exhaustion and desperate hope for so long, steadied as they learned to braid Lucy's hair and tie her shoes with the patience that grandfatherhood required. The community's embrace extended beyond practical support into the realm of understanding that went deeper than words. Frank Morrison, the lobsterman who had known Robert for 40 years, began stopping by each evening for coffee and conversation that never directly addressed the tragedy, but provided the male companionship that helped process grief through shared silence. Their discussions of weather patterns and fishing conditions served as a form of therapy, familiar rhythms that restored some sense of normalcy to days that still felt surreal. Lucy's first day back at Port Haven Elementary School required careful orchestration between Robert, Dr. Reeves, and Principal Janet Walsh. The 8-year-old's classmates had been prepared for her return with age-appropriate explanations that satisfied curiosity, without overwhelming her with questions. Her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Holmes, rearranged the classroom seating to ensure Lucy had clear sight lines to all exits, understanding that captivity had instilled hypervigilance that would take time to fade. The playground became Lucy's greatest challenge and eventual triumph, the open space initially triggering panic responses that sent her racing back to the building's safety. Robert stood watch from the school fence, his presence a constant reminder that she was protected, that the adults in her world would not allow harm to reach her again. Gradually, tentatively, she began to venture further from the building's shelter, her natural childhood curiosity slowly overcoming the learned caution that imprisonment had instilled. Evening routines became sacred rituals that provided structure to days that still felt fragile and uncertain. Robert would read to Lucy from the same books he had once read to her mother, his voice carrying across generations of family tradition that Alistair's madness could not destroy. The child would fall asleep to stories of brave fishermen and magical sea creatures, her small hand clutching her grandfather's weathered fingers as if anchoring herself to safety through physical contact. The legal proceedings surrounding Alistair's arrest played out in courtrooms that Robert attended faithfully, though he shielded Lucy from the details of testimony that revealed the full scope of the hermit's crimes. The community followed the case through local newspaper coverage that treated the story with respectful restraint, understanding that sensationalism would only compound the trauma that families like Robert's were struggling to overcome. Justice, when it came, felt less like victory than like a necessary closing of one chapter in a story that was still being written. Sunday services at Port Haven Methodist Church became another anchor point in their recovery, the congregation's quiet acceptance providing spiritual support without overwhelming attention. Pastor William Green's sermons seemed crafted specifically for their healing journey, messages about resilience and faith that spoke to the particular challenges of surviving trauma while honoring the memory of those who had not. The hymns that Lucy slowly learned to sing became expressions of hope that she couldn't yet articulate in ordinary conversation. As autumn turned to winter, Robert and Lucy developed their own private memorial rituals that honored Eliza's memory, while affirming their commitment to building a future together. They would visit her grave weekly, bringing fresh flowers and sharing stories that kept her presence alive in their daily lives. Lucy's artwork began to include images of her mother watching over them from clouds that looked suspiciously like the fog banks that had once seemed so threatening, suggesting that healing was allowing her to reclaim even traumatic symbols as sources of comfort. The bond between grandfather and granddaughter deepened through shared survival, their relationship forged in the crucible of loss, but tempered by the strength that comes from refusing to surrender hope. Robert's weathered hands, which had once trembled with desperate searching, now moved with steady confidence as they helped Lucy navigate homework, braided her hair for school, and tucked her safely into bed each night. Their love for each other had become a living memorial to Eliza's sacrifice, proof that her final act of courage had preserved something precious and irreplaceable in the face of unthinkable darkness. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.